This is a porcelain statuette of the Baron von Blauheimer holding a peace dove on his cocked fist. The statuette dates from the 1980s, but it is modeled after a real historical figure from an earlier time, the 1970s. The man is my uncle, Ray Ray, the Baron von Blauheimer, and he's depicted here in his full Baron regalia, which doubled as his only clothes. In the 1970s, it was still rare for a grown man to go to work in a lace cravat with petticoat breeches, especially if that man, like Ray Ray, worked as a garbage collector for the city of Newark. But Ray Ray was a bundle of contradictions, sensitive but hard-edged, coquettish yet vengeful, fastidious but filthy, compassionate, civil rights activist, also a bodybuilder who delighted in beating up hippies. This statuette represents Ray Ray's attempts to reconcile two sides of his personality. The cocked fist is a symbol of the fight-ready posture he adopted so many times at pool halls, punk rock concerts, and fondue orgies of the 70s. While the white dove atop his hand represents his message of peace. As Ray would say, it's up to you, friend. Give peace a chance, or taste the 5 knucklemen of von Blauheimer. So the story continues, but I'll stop there. Needless to say, that's all fiction, and it was invented by Rob Baedeker for the Significant Objects Project. Rob is a member of the comedy troupe Casper Hauser, a very excellent improv group out in San Francisco. Significant Objects is a project that was co-founded by Joshua Glenn and myself, and I'll talk about it later. All you need to know right now is that it involved us recruiting a bunch of people like Rob Baedeker and persuading them to make up stories about a bunch of thrift store stuff that we had bought. And as it happens, I think this piece really achieves, and with sort of great panache, the hardest thing of writing about an object, which is really making you see the object. And that can only be done by really seeing the object yourself. And that doesn't really sound very hard, but I think it actually is, because we're confronted with so many objects, products, devices, gizmos, stuff, crap, junk, whatever you want to call it, ads for stuff, pictures of stuff on blogs. And we don't really have time to truly see it all. And objects like this, I think, almost resist attention because you just sort of want to categorize it as kitschy junk and just move on. But really everything in Rob's story, I think, kind of snaps this object into focus. He sort of really does look like a 70s guy. And why is he wearing that outfit? And the juxtaposition of the cocked fist and the dove is something you might not notice at first, but then you realize it really is kind of the focal point. It's a strange paradox. But my listing these visual points is really not all that engaging, whereas Rob's story is, by the use of pure imagination. And I'll return to that point, but first I want to go through quickly some of the more workaday, commonplace forms of fiction in the marketplace that I was referring to earlier. And I do this because I think it's important to be able to sort of tease out differences among these different forms and recognize their motivations. So, a first form, lies, pretty, straightforward, fraud, false claims, that kind of thing. It doesn't really happen all that often, so I don't have that much to say about it. Much more common is bullshit, which is different. And if you've never read Harry Frankfurt's, he's a professor emeritus of philosophy at Princeton, he's excellent on this subject. And particularly in distinguishing the difference between lies and bullshit. The liar, he points out, is inescapably concerned with truth values, because in order to invent a lie at all, he must think he knows what is true. Whereas bullshit, in his view, is a result of indifference to the truth, indifference to how things really are. That's what he calls the essence of bullshit. So if you think about it, that just kind of describes a lot of advertising. Does a certain energy drink give you wings? Well, it's not like they've tested that and know that it's false. They don't really care one way or the other. They're just, bullshitting. So that's one form. And it's kind of distant from the object. And if you get a little bit closer to the object, here's a story designed by Apple in California. No, it's not a lie, and I wouldn't even call it bullshit. And what I'm going to call this is a form of mythology, following on Roland Barthes' version of mythology. And I would normally never drop the name Barthes in this talk, but again, it's an academic conference. I make a nod at this kind of thing. And if you did your assigned reading and you read mythologies, which many of you probably were supposed to do, you might remember there's this example that he uses to make his point where he talks about a magazine cover depicting a French black soldier saluting the French flag. And he makes the case in kind of a Baroque way about how this advances this mythology of France as a great empire, right? Like that's what that picture really is. And the interesting part of his theory that I think is relevant now to me is that for that process to happen, one thing that has to occur is that the sort of history of the image or the symbol kind of drains away or gets pushed aside. The way he puts it is it's put at a distance. In this case, it would be the biography of that individual soldier, whatever their actual history is, it's kind of minimized so that they can play this symbolic role in this advancing this mythology, right? So this kind of, in a way, could be argued to have a similar function. Every Apple product you buy, it's in a lovely box and it has this slogan printed on it. And while you're focusing on that, this other thing kind of drains away, which is the material or the sort of the object's biography of the thing that's in the box, like who made it and where and under what conditions and from what, sourced where, how, what consequences, all these other things. The sort of biography is left at a distance. And, you know, there's a story there too. And I'm not here to pick on Apple or even to like complain about late stage capitalism or anything like that. My point is just that any object doesn't just have a story, it has many stories that are on this kind of continuum from hard truths to really pure imaginary speculations and fictions. And further from that, I think that sort of being able to recognize that and deal with it opens up a lot of really cool, interesting opportunities for clever observers of material culture. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. This is a page from a catalog that someone sent me. And they didn't send it to me because they thought I was looking for a cute outfit. They sent it to me because that book in her hand is the British edition of a book that I wrote that's really not very friendly toward marketing culture. The British version was called I'm With the Brand, and this friend of mine thought it was funny that that would be used as a kind of prop in a catalog. And it reminded me of one of my favorite all-time pieces of nonfiction writing about objects, basically. It was Nicholson Baker's piece in about 1995 called, I think called Books as Furniture. And that whole piece was kind of this long riff on noticing books and how they're used in catalogs for lifestyle products companies and clothing companies and stuff like that, and really breaking it down. And he sort of makes this point that it's surrounding printed fiction with life-size fictional rooms that resemble our own real rooms, except they're a good deal neater, costlier, and more literate. And I can't really give his piece its full due, but I think it's an incredible example of sort of using the power of imagination to spot and break down and counterpunch the kinds of fictions that exist in the workaday marketplace. And I'm going to throw in this quote from Richard Feynman that I literally encountered on today, and it's not exactly, I'm taking it way out of context, but I just can't resist. Feynman said, "Our imagination is stretched to the utmost, not as in fiction, to imagine things which are not really there, but just to comprehend those things that are there." And I think that's a powerful sort of payoff to thinking about the market in these terms. Okay, so but that's enough about that. Let's turn to further on that continuum of the away from facts and towards imagination to some stuff that's actually kind of fun and that I like. I've written actually repeatedly about what I call, I guess I would say that they're examples of imagination. This sounds a little paradoxical, but imagination fiction that's more honest about its fictionness, sort of more explicit, transparent attempts to bring the imaginary into the real. So I did a column a few years ago about a company called Last Exit to Nowhere that sells t-shirts with brands, logos from the movies. If you've seen Blade Runner, this is the company that makes replicants. Here's Dapper Dan from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And my personal favorite, those of you who want to advertise the Soylent Corporation, your shirt's available. Another approach to this is a company called Omni Consumer Products, and Omni Consumer Products was a company in the movie RoboCop, but it's also now an actual company in Oakland, and they're kind of on the leading edge of what used to be called reverse product placement and is now referred to as defictionalization, which is taking things from movies and entertainments and bringing them into actual life. If you ever saw the movie Idiocracy, you might remember a product called Brondo, which was this hilarious, ridiculous drink, and the Thirst Mutilator it was called, and it's got electrolytes, and it was emblematic of this idiocracy that they were living. Well, this guy thought it would be a good idea for that to exist, so he made it. I have a can of it in my refrigerator. He's also done products from Ron Burgundy's Sex Panther cologne, the Stay Puft Marshmallows from Ghostbusters, True Blood from True Blood, of course. He wasn't involved in this, but you may remember a promotion for the Simpsons movie a few years ago, which was one of the biggest examples of defictionalizing products all at once. A lot of the phony products from the show were sold at these 7-Elevens that were temporarily rebranded as Quickie Marts, and you could go in there and actually buy some Buzz soda and some Crustios and stuff like this. And you could kind of characterize this stuff. There are other examples, and you can kind of characterize it all as an extension of fandom. But I think at the same time, there's something else going on, which is a kind of critique of what the boundaries are between the real and the unreal when you're talking about a concept like brands. I mean, what does it mean to be a real brand versus not a real brand? And what's the reality there and what isn't? And who decides? And what are the sort of terms on which that decision is made? And to push further in this direction, I think I see my friend Gladys Santiago is here. And she runs a great blog on the subject of product displacement, which is the insertion of a phony brand in an entertainment to sort of suggest an actual brand. And there are various reasons to do this. Sometimes it's an intellectual property thing. 30 Rock does it a lot for sort of comic and then, parodic purposes. Overstock.com becomes overshop.com. The Simpsons does this pretty much every episode. And this is another thing from Gladys's product displacement site. They brought that into the real world. I don't know who would sue whom for this if they tried to sell it. Other imaginary brand exercises can have more sort of pointed critiques. This is a group called Trustco Corp, that makes sort of imaginary anti-brands and shop drops them. Shop dropping being the opposite of shoplifting, when you make something and leave it in a store. So nose job in a can. A student out in San Francisco wrote to me a couple of years ago with her thesis project, which was called Superlux, and it was a whole line of fictitious products intended to draw attention to the branding mystique and marketing gimmicks that make luxury luxurious. She did a great job. This is one that I was sort of involved in. Veladone RX was a phony drug that was just used in a psychology study on the placebo effect done by Dan Ariely, predictably irrational author, and he just needed a phony drug name to make whatever point he was studying, and I happened to read that study and thought it would be funny to get someone to do a logo for it. And Angie Mora-Marco, who was a student at SCAD at the time, did this logo. And she now works at Mr. Youth here in New York, so that shows that students who help me out with my stupid ideas go on to great things. And Dan Ariely ended up buying a bunch of these t-shirts, and there's mine. Okay, this is another student who wrote, I think he wrote into significant objects with the heirloom. The full concept was the heirloom supply company. So you can sort of make heirlooms, all the things you need to get your heirlooms on. And his visual reference here, I really like this project a lot, but his visual reference here was the 826 National Stores, sort of associated with Dave Eggers. That's the writing program, and they have these incredible storefronts. They have the Pirate Supply, or I guess it's called the Pirate Store in San Francisco, where you can get things like peg leg oil. And here in New York, the Superhero Supply Company, where you go buy a gallon of gravity. I think they have anti-gravity as well. And this is a book that they put out just last year that's fantastic, of just sort of a catalog of all the imaginary products that you can go buy at their storefronts. And I think it's a really great example of using imagination and design in the marketplace to a good end. In this case, A26 National is a tutoring program for young people. And there's one last variation on this that I'll mention. This is an imaginary product called Green Cell, and it was made for a contest by some young designers who their firm is called Rich Brilliant Willing. Since then they've gotten a lot of attention. And their concept here was the problem of different sized batteries for all of our different devices and gizmos would be solved by this sort of one-size-fits-all rechargeable battery. Contests and exhibitions are sort of big incubators of fictional products, but in general, I see them as being a little bit, they're kind of outside the marketplace, it's a little bit of a different thing. I wanted just one representation of that in here, but there's tons of stuff like that. I just, it's a little bit different. Most of the examples I just talked about, I wouldn't characterize as mythology or bullshit. What I would call them is tricks. And my reference there is Trickster Makes This World, Lewis Hyde's book, which is about these recurring themes in trickster legends and mythology in everything from Native American sort of tales to Norse mythology and Greek mythology, and these trickster figures and these adventures that they have that always involve playing with boundaries, basically. The trickster will take some stupid or mischievous or duplicitous action, and it kind of changes some boundary. Oversimplifying it a little bit. But trickster is the god of the threshold in all its forms, is how Hyde puts it. And more to the point, what he's really arguing is that that's where culture comes from, is play at the boundaries. And he points to examples like John Cage, what is silence, what is music, or Marcel Duchamp, what is a mass-produced object and what is art, and they're kind of trickstery ways that change our answers to those questions, or at least challenge our traditional answers to those questions. I'm operating in a little bit different context with these things, but I think that there's still a very trickstery spirit going on, a lot of play at the boundaries with these kinds of imaginary products. And it brings us into that realm of expressing with imagination, and what Bruce Sterling calls it speculative culture, which is not a bad term. So I'm going to move toward the conclusion here by talking about, by sort of shifting away from stuff I've written about to some stuff I've been directly involved in. One of them is the Significant Objects Project. This is a collaboration, as I said, with Josh Glenn. And it came about because I broke a coffee mug. The market value of this object at the time that I broke it was probably about zero. But I was really upset because it meant a lot to me. I bought it on a trip with the woman I later married, sentimental value. And the interesting thing about that is that my story sort of trumped the object story. It doesn't matter who designed this, what it's made of, what branding might have been poured into making it meaningful. What mattered was my story. And I was interested in sort of this imposing of a story onto something, almost at random. It almost didn't matter what the thing was. You could just impose this story on it and its value changed. And I thought, well, could you just make up a story? And would that change the value of something? An inventive narrative. And then Josh, who I didn't know at the time, came out with this book, which is a collection of essays, a really excellent collection of essays of writers kind of talking about odd things that they own that mean a lot to them. And that connection between narrative and value made me think, well, Josh is someone that I should get in touch with this guy. And we had some conversations, and he liked what I was thinking, and he had some great ideas about it, so we teamed up. And we went shopping, and we bought a bunch of these kinds of things at thrift stores and flea markets and yard sales, just stuff like this. And we rounded up a bunch of writers of varying backgrounds, some best-selling people and fiction people and nonfiction people and anyone imaginative, comedians, television writers. These are some of the better-known names, and many of the names were not well-known. They were just people who we knew, or it was basically anyone who was very imaginative and could come up with a good story and who would return our email. So the two main criteria. The stories they came up with were just all over the place. Some were almost like traditional short stories. Some were sort of fake encyclopedia entries. Sometimes the object was magic, or sometimes it was alive, or it was, sometimes it was cursed, and like buying this object would be or owning this thing would be terrible. It would be the worst thing that ever happened to you. Like we actually had to put a rule in that no more fatal objects at a certain point. But our hypothesis was that those stories, that they would measurably increase the value of the stuff that we had bought. So how do you prove that? Well, we put them all up for sale on eBay with the story, the invented story, as the product description. And to be clear, we were not hoaxing. There were disclaimers on things saying explicitly this is a made-up story. And there was a link back to our site explaining what we were up to. So what happened? Well, we had bought, there were 100 objects. We had spent a total of $128.74 on those 100 objects. And in the end, we sold them for a grand total of $3,612.51. That is a 2,706% increase in value, for those of you who haven't already done that in your head. The individual writers got the money, by the way. Here was our top seller. That's our top 25. We had a blast doing this, so we bought another 100 objects, got more writers, and but we proved our point, so we kind of just went nuts and decided we would do it as a charity thing. And we did even better with the second 100. We raised almost $4,000, which we gave to 826 National and Girls Write Now, which is another writing program here in New York for at-risk young women. And we worked with all these different partners. We did found objects and all kinds of just crazy things. The only one that I want to sort of zero in on, because it kind of brings this project, to me it was like the thing that brought it full circle, is that I wanted to do something where we could take that idea of the story driving things more than the object driving things, like take that as far as it could go. So we sold a mystery object, which was just, we promised there would be an object, but we wouldn't show it to you until the bidding was over. And the story was by Ben Greenman. It was an excellent story. And it sold for $103.50. So we did some more stories after that, and some more sort of one-off things, but then we had to take a break and put the site on a hiatus so we could analyze our findings. Pie charts. And what we're really doing is that we're sort of preparing, there's going to be a book version of it later part of this year from Fantagraphics of the top 100, so our 100 of the best stories. And we're sort of working on that. And while that's going on, I got involved in this other project. And the broken coffee cup of the other project, which is called the Hypothetical Development Organization, was this real estate sign in my neighborhood in Savannah, which I was just walking past one day, and it's on a sort of dilapidated little building in my neighborhood, and depicting this future where it's going to be this big condo boutique mixed use thing, great addition to the neighborhood. And I realized, like, wow, I've been walking past this exact sign for 4 years. Nothing has changed. And actually, that building is for sale. That whatever's going to happen to it depends on someone buying it and whatever they want to do. So that sign is just sort of a hypothetical. It's like a story. I thought, well, that's interesting. And there's a lot of signs like this. I never really thought about it before. And there's even more buildings like this that don't have a sign on them. And that's kind of depressing. So what if you made up fake futures for these buildings, like really obviously fake things, and put those on signs, and put those signs on those buildings? That'd be kind of interesting. And I said, I really hope somebody does that, because it sounds like a lot of work, and I don't want to be involved. But my wife, Ellen Susan, who's a photographer and designer, and our friend G.K. Darby in New Orleans, who's publisher and founder of Garrett County Press, they decided we should do it, convinced me that we should do it. So here's how it worked. The shorthand was implausible futures for unpopular places. So first we would find an unpopular place, a building that seemed to have no discernible plans, no real future in front of it, and then we would dream up a hypothetical future for it. We wanted it to be blatantly implausible and hopefully either funny or provocative, somehow engaging. So in this case, we decided it's kind of near some galleries and museums in downtown New Orleans, and we decided it would be a museum dedicated to the most important figure of our time, which is the self. So it would be like covered with mirrors, and there would be some kind of emblematic way, a monumental way of capturing sort of our strange yearning for the approval of strangers that we seem to have today. So it became the Museum of the Self. You will like this museum. Dave Pinter did the rendering, artist and writer here in New York. Printed it on 3-foot by 5-foot coroplast. People, not me, put it on the building. I had nothing to do with that. And we ended up doing, put them on, there were 10 on buildings around New Orleans. I was just there, and some of them are still up, some of them are down. But I'll share with you just a couple more. This space was our collaborator sort of on it was Candy Chang, who's a really interesting artist living in New Orleans now. And the concept that we came up with her was the mobile cornucopia. And I'll read you the thing. No fresh produce, meat, or seafood in your neighborhood? Here's one implausible solution, inspired by the well-known role of the produce truck in New Orleans history and culture. The hypothetical mobile cornucopia could come to you and provide a never-ending flow of fresh local fare. It's an entire building mounted on a pickup, overflowing with tasty foodstuffs. There it is on the building. For this one, it's kind of in a mixed-use area, residential and commercial, and a lot of boutiques, but then also scattered through these empty buildings. And we decided this would be the loitering center. No loitering signage is commonplace not just in New Orleans, but in many cities, frequently in neighborhoods that mishmash vacant buildings and retail. So why not have some place that invite the public to come in and loiter? It's the Loitering Center. It's done by Mark Williams, architect in New Orleans, very talented, charming fellow. There it is on the building. And then the last one, for this, we have this idea for the retail karma market, the place to go and take the good karma that others have given you and sell it secondhand. Trade your spare karma for cold hard cash, cash for karma, this kind of thing. The interesting thing about this, so the name of it was that became Carmelot. To get these signs printed, we did a fundraiser online, and one of our sort of things was if you would give us a certain amount, you could buy naming rights to one of the buildings. And someone took us up on that. And it was, in fact, the School of Visual Arts, Masters of Professional Studies in Branding, class of 2011. So they came up with the name and the logo and the whole brand identity, and they brought in the artist, Mauricio Espinosa, did this rendering. You can't see it that well, but it's Carmelot there, and based on the thing. And like I said, some of these signs have gone down, but I was just in New Orleans, and this one's still up. First time I've ever really done that thing. Okay. This is a volunteer project. We work with all these great people. And I wanted to make sure that okay, there. I thought I had dropped out a name. We actually did a dozen pieces. 2 of them, the buildings were showing signs of real development, so we didn't put those up on the building. But we also had a gallery show. We made duplicates of the signs on sort of thinner paper, and that's up right now. If you still have friends in if you have friends in New Orleans, it's still up through May 7th at Dumois Gallery on Frere Street. And we put little documentation pictures and everything. So to sort of wrap everything up then, with both of those projects, the idea is using imagination both in a critique way and in an expression way. In terms of the critique, the main thing that sort of draws those 2 projects together is paying attention to the stuff that you're sort of not supposed to pay attention to. Because you're supposed to pay attention to, the white iPhone or whatever, not to thrift store trinkets and broken coffee cups and things like that. You're supposed to pay attention to whatever Frank Gehry is doing next, not to derelict buildings and real estate signage. In terms of expression, right after we launched Hypothetical Development, we got an email from someone who really hated it, and his name was Glenn, and he said, demanded to know, what does your organization hope to achieve in real-world value? The buildings you feature in New Orleans are for the greatest part not available to you or anyone else and are under the jurisdiction of the Historic Landmarks Commission. I don't see the point. Well, I don't know about the landmarks thing. He's right. We were not in a position to buy any of these buildings. Didn't want to. That wasn't the idea. But I'm interested in his question. What does your organization hope to achieve in real-world value? Because that's the big question about all this stuff. These sort of imaginary objects and brands and fictional critiques and speculative culture in general. Like, what's the point? Where's the real-world value? A number of ways to answer that. One of the great current people thinking about this, I think, is this guy, Stephen Duncombe, who teaches at NYU, and has spoken quite eloquently about the value of speculation and dreams and the impossible as ways to, as he once put it, open up spaces to imagine new possibilities and solutions. And I think there's a resonance with that, with the trickster idea that Lewis Hyde talked about, and that sort of play of the boundaries. In the case of significant objects, the obvious trick was the transformation of objects from sort of junk into things that people were really kind of pleased to own. We had people meet up with our our contributors at conferences and get them to sign it. We had people putting things in frames. One of our objects, Neil LaBute wrote about this candle, and it ended up in an actual art show in sort of about object culture in LA. And a little less obvious than that is we use, the less obvious trick is that we use these sort of worthless seeming things as inspiration to call into existence this really amazing outpouring of creativity through the stories. All these fantastic stories that were sort of enjoyed by thousands of people for nothing. You didn't have to bid to enjoy the stories. The last thing we did before we went on our hiatus was a live event for Litquake in San Francisco. That's Rob Baedeker actually was our MC. And we were able to include as part of that letting the audience on the spot sort of take a shot at making up stories, sort of improvising stories about one of the objects. And there was a contest, it was the Object Slam. And that just is creating a lot of value for nothing that I think is kind of a neat trick. As for hypothetical developments, people still ask us, wouldn't it be cool if one of those buildings really got built, if there really was loiter, et cetera, if you looked into that? What can I say? Like, that would be stranger than fiction, but we were doing fiction. And ultimately, they were just stories. And I shouldn't even say just stories, because it's not an apology. Stories have value. They have real value. In other words, I think that a good story, unlike, say, bullshit or mythology, is not just a means to an end. It is an end. And that's what we were trying to do, this time with signs on buildings. And the moment, that's of interest, that you're shooting for, is the random passerby who suddenly notices that building that they've walked past, 100 times, because there's this sign on it. It's telling this really arrestingly weird story. And maybe it doesn't happen all that often. Maybe most people don't notice. But when it does happen, I think that moment makes the building exist in a new way, and I think it makes the passerby exist in a new way. Whether we succeeded or not, that's the goal of all writing and expression about material culture, speculative, fictional, or otherwise, making people see things, objects, in the built environment in a new way. And that moment, whenever you can pull it off, and however you pull it off, is not a call to make something happen, or a promise that something might happen, or an exhortation that you should hope for something to happen at some point. That moment is something happening. And that's some trick. And it's not hypothetical or imaginary or speculative at all. It's as real as it gets. Thank you so much for your time. And if anybody has questions or stuff, that's my email.